One is, who is the audience? And two is, what are you trying to get them to do?
Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who address the challenges and best practices to deliver your message effectively. That might be one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is Jim Rowe. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Jim. 1, he has 45 years in marketing, which includes the client side and the provider side. In the client side, he held the position brand manager, Coke, and VP marketing at Cuddy Sark. Good collection, good places to go for drinks. And then 35 years on the agency side, first as president of 2 small Saatchi divisions, then owner of MME for 27 years, and now Jim Rowe Marketing since 2018. 2, Jim has leveraged those 45 years and recently published Get Your Ducks in a Row. It's a 2-book series to help executives address the skills gap, which is the poor problem-solving, communication, and writing skills of recent graduates, as noted in many studies. In fact, skills that everyone takes for granted, but Inc. magazine reports that this costs corporations $400 billion a year in mistakes and productivity losses. And avoiding the traditional boring business book style, Jim was inspired by Who Moved My Cheese? So his book is a short fable that helps teach executives in 1 hour with 10 steps how to think, write, present, and sell. And when they write, put it all on 1 page. Oh, the book's only $15. And 3, Jim was fortunate to have been trained to think and write as a classical packaged goods marketer. And he loved passing this important discipline to scores of young executives. It's his passion and project for the rest of his career and life. He's also donating $1 from every book sold to the National Writing Project, which is a 48-year-old charity that focuses on teaching teachers to teach writing.
Great organization.
Jim Rowe, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Well, thank you very much, George. I also love the title of your podcast. As I sent to you when I first reached out, the Your Intended Message is exactly right in line with my thinking.
And Jim, let's follow that thinking. Often, I believe the problem we're seeing, particularly from these recent graduates, is that their intended message isn't getting through.
That's correct.
And where are they falling down?
Well, I think, what has happened is that we are not really teaching our young executives and young people in school. We're not teaching them to be disciplined thinkers in order to communicate better. And I think what happens is, if you say to somebody, do you know how to write and do you know how to think and do you know how to communicate, everybody's going to say yes, because we do it all day long on social media. However, there is so little training as it relates to writing. And that, to me, my fundamental premise here is 5 words. To write is to think. And I think we do so little writing that and students in general, and a lot of executives, if we don't spend our time writing, we're not training ourselves to think clearly. And I think that's really a big part of the problem.
And I remember in many eons ago, when I was young, writing letters to other people. And it wasn't something that everyone did, but we certainly did a lot more of it in my younger day than today. In fact, people don't even send birthday cards anymore.
Right. Yeah. They send a funny emoji. Yes. And I think what happens is we've just gotten to the point where these young students now, frankly, there I found, while I started this in the early 2000s, I started recognizing that the young grads that we were hiring, and we vetted them pretty well. We were three former client-side marketing guys. We made sure they had, marketing or communications degrees. They had good GPAs. They had courses that we thought were relevant. But even then, we thought we vetted them well. They'd come in, and you'd start noticing that not all of them, some of them were great, but not all of them had good writing skills. And it wasn't that they weren't smart, it's just that they hadn't been well trained in that. So we had to, as a busy executive, when you hire somebody, your purpose is to have somebody else do the work for you, particularly on the agency side. And if you have to spend so much time training them to write or rewriting what they're doing, that's really negatively impacting your own productivity. So what happens is, what I have learned over time is that one is in the marketing world, you're trained to get this down to 10 steps. You're trained to create a brief that you can quickly communicate and think through a message and communicate it to somebody. And what happens, I think, today is because they communicate so much casually, they don't go through this disciplined process, and they take for granted. If you want to talk to somebody about communication, everybody kind of rolls their eyes. But if you ask, there was just an article this weekend in Harvard Business Review, and they say one of the top skills leaders are going to need. And, yes, they all have to have their tactical skills in their field, but their technical skills, they need to be able to communicate, because that's the core thing to move a corporation and a team forward. So I just think that too many people take it for granted, and they don't even realize they're not very good at it.
Jim, do you recommend that people journal?
That's an interesting question. I have never been somebody who journals, but I think that's a great additional concept to practice your writing if you're doing it. The beauty of it is the only thing I would say about doing a journal is it's kind of your thoughts and what's been going on. And I think I've been reading a lot now. Once I discovered the problem on my own, and then I discovered all this research that supports that communication is a big problem. Then I dug deeper into why that's happening from the educational standpoint. I started looking into the educational world, and a lot of, the way they teach writing is there's like the 6 styles, there's narrative and expository, and they eventually get to argumentative and persuasive. Some studies I've seen or articles I've seen combine them, and some of them are separate. But at the end of the day, a lot of them teachers, and I listened to a lot of teachers' podcasts in the last 6 months, and I find that they want to have people express themselves. I think that's great, because that everything isn't all about business and being super structured. But when it comes to business, you need to have writing that teaches you to think critically. And the problem, to me, the issue with a journal would be maybe you're not thinking critically, you're just expressing what's going on. So I think it's a good idea to write. The more you write, the better. I mean, one of my thoughts actually is, I've gone through this process. We always talk about how important reading is. Reading is critically important because it helps expand and makes you think about things. But when you think about it, reading is passive. Somebody has already done the hard work. So I'm a big believer in the writing, because writing is active. Writing is really what separates the men from the boys, so to speak. It's the one that makes you say, okay, I need to commit to this. And as the process of writing, now I've been writing for 45 years. In marketing, that's what we do. I passed Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours about 20 years ago, I'm sold. But I mean, the idea is anybody who writes is writing all the time, and you need to keep, even I write every day, and every day I'm re-editing as I go along. Think about, and here's the metaphor I use. Tiger Woods and I both play golf. All right. I'm not very good. Sometimes I'll shoot 84, sometimes I'll shoot 104. But Tiger Woods and all of these golf pros, they live this, and they're the best in the world. And what do they do all the time? They're constantly going out to the range. They hire coaches to train them. They can beat them on the course, but they can't They need somebody else to help them see what they're doing. So why do we think one of the most important skill sets in our lives, particularly in the workforce, is communication? We don't have to work at it. You have to work at it. You have to learn how to edit and write and try and be succinct.
One of the challenges with writing is you don't get it right the first time.
Exactly. And that's why editing is so critical. That's why newspapers have editors. You write the first pass. So when I sent you asked me to give you a little summary. I probably spent an hour on it. It was one page, but and even though I've done it a million times, you asked the question in a certain way, so I had to refine it. And the other thing that people don't think about is they don't think about the audience. So, your title, your intended message, George, it's so important. Your intended message is relevant to who you're speaking to. It's relevant to the audience. And one of the 10 points I have in my books is you start with what's the purpose, and the first part of the purpose is, well, who you're talking to. If you're talking to the senior executive that you're trying to sell them something, that's one approach and one message. But if you're talking to your team, it's a whole different perspective. It could be about the same topic.
And Jim, I'm reminded, and I'm looking back at my own corporate career, and there was a time when I remember I was asking and I was a manager, mid-level manager, and I was asking for them to pay for me to join an association. And so I wrote a letter, and I wrote it, said, these are all the things that I can get from the association. And it came back refused.
Okay.
And then I rewrote it, and this time I wrote a letter saying, as a result of my membership, here's what I've done, and here's how it's helped the organization. Yes. That was approved.
Yeah. You really have to look at it from all different aspects. And, as much as I've been in marketing, and that's what we're trained to do, even the process I've been going through since I launched published the first book in late January, I'm refining my message as I speak to people like yourself and make sure I'm hitting all the right points, and you keep refining it. I think that, one of the great speeches of all time, which I love to listen to, and most people here in America understand it, is when JFK at his inauguration said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And I remember reading an article years ago saying that he had been working on that message for months on the campaign trail. And it wasn't until he got to writing the inauguration speech, and I can't remember his name, I think it was Sorkin, who worked with him on it, that he crystallized it into that, and it's gone down as one of the great speeches and one of the great phrases of all time, which I wholeheartedly adhere to as well.
And I think what you said there behind that phrase, that wasn't just something that came to him in the shower one day. That's something that he worked at for months.
Yes.
And probably reworded it and said, well, what do you think of this? Nah. Or, okay, better than the one you had yesterday, but not there yet.
Yeah. It needs to resonate. And, the other thing I do, and I say a little bit more about this in book 2, is, and I used to close my door all the time at my office, is it's important to read it out loud. Now, he had a great voice, great diction and cadence and all that. But when I'm reading even something that's never going to be read out loud, I read it a lot of times to myself, because it helps you realize, oh, that doesn't really sound great. It's a process. Actors, golfers, all these things, you work on your craft. To me, communication, particularly writing, it's a craft. Whether that's what you do for a living, or whether that's part of how you communicate, get your point across for a living, it's a craft, and you need to work at it.
I also had the good fortune in my corporate career. There was a point where my boss said, "You need some help with your writing," and he sent me to a tutor who gave me tutoring on my writing, and so I pulled out recent memos and reports and letters that I'd written and gave them to her, and then she sat down with me and she marked it up with a red pen.
Felt like you were back in school, right?
Oh yeah. But it was a great learning, because I had no clue how bad I was. And here's one of the big ahas that I didn't realize until she pointed it out to me, and now I can't not see it. She pointed out to me that even writing has tone.
Yes, great point. Yes, it does have tone. And I try to write, some things can be just, in the book, I talk about how you can read the book in 1 hour, get it down to 10 steps. So a lot of when I focus on things, those are the 10 structured steps. And so I try, and particularly for a busy executive, is we try and get those down to 1 page. So there isn't necessarily always tone in the words, but if you're delivering 1 page to a senior executive and you're sitting across from the CEO, and by the way, 1 page is a great lesson to try and use and an approach, because it forces you to think so clearly and get out. But even when you're talking and I'm communicating to somebody off of my 1 page, and I often will read it because I don't have full sentences, I give it flavor. I give it tone.
Jim, can you give us some of those 10 steps, some of those gems?
Oh, sure. Well, it starts with, and by the way, it's not like I made this up. This is a foundation of marketing thinking that's been going on for years. And frankly, and when I say get down to 1 page, is that, Procter & Gamble, I grew up, I didn't go to work at Procter & Gamble, but everybody who helped train me in the early days of my career, they had all been there. In fact, they kind of acted like they had gone to Harvard, when I was at Procter. But it was all about being so concise and so deliberate. And Procter, in those days, it was just typewriters. They had rules. It had to be 1 page. Had to answer these 5 questions. It had to be structured. They how wide the margins could be. I mean, it was a big deal. Jack Welch, CEO of General Electric, 20 years, grew the company 34 times. He wanted big presentations down to 1 page. Get me down and let us get down to it. So it forced you to think. But let's start with the 10 steps. As I mentioned before, it's the first one is purpose. And there's 2 parts of purpose. One is, who is the audience? And 2 is, what are you trying to get them to do? I had a friend of mine say to me, the senior executive went, I would love to get a memo that at the end of the memo, I knew what they wanted me to do. Did they want me to approve this? Tell them no. I mean, I finished it and I didn't know what to expect. So and a lot of people confuse purpose with objective. Purpose is what's the purpose of the communication. It's not what the objective you're trying to achieve. So that's the first one, purpose. Then you got to get into the background. And I always find, some people say, well, they already know that. To me, particularly when presenting to a group of people in a room, and every time I write, I always think it's going to be eventually a presentation, is what does everybody know? What's the foundation that is without refute? This is the foundation of background. This is what these people know. This is what's going on out there. So you have context and a frame of reference. So background, purpose. Once you do that, okay, so why are we here? And I call that the issues. What are the problems or the issues that we have to contend with? Competition has just launched a new project and it's a new product and it's eating our lunch. That's an issue. Or they've dropped their prices. What do we do? What do we need to address here? I mean, every day there's an issue. You just got to figure out what the issues are. And by the way, this is part of critical thinking, identify. And what's really important too is to have some data and research to back up this shouldn't just be a point of view. These are pretty hard facts. So once you lay out the issue, the next thing is pretty obvious. What do we want to do about it? What is our goal here? And I think, too often, I remember in the early days of marketing, and you sit with the advertising agency and they'd say, well, we want to increase awareness. I remember thinking to myself, well, what does that mean? The beauty today, I mean, I was born too early because I would love to have grown up through the digital world as opposed to have to catch up because I'm older and I'm not doing the details of it because I started out in research. That was where I was better than others in that I knew about the numbers. So lay out the objectives and make them sure they have metrics. Put a number to it. If it's to, increase sales or decrease cost, put a percentage or a value on that. So now you have your objective. Now it's, okay, here's the big one. And this is the hardest one. What's your strategy? How are you going to do that? It can be very simple, like, okay, let's get into, okay, if there's a price war, think about the airlines. Somebody else starts doing discounted airlines, you don't want to discount, we'll give away a frequent flyer program. That's a strategy. Or do we match their price or go deeper or run different kind of promotions? That's a strategy. And then after the strategy, it may be a nice idea. What's your support for that strategy? And I call that the rationale. Why is this going to work? And there you also need data to say, if we do this and look at this information and we think this is why this is going to work. So now you've laid out the whole critical thinking process, and then you start moving into the executional phase. And I think too many people, a lot of times, it's not like when you finish a play and you get an applause, because sometimes, you finish a great presentation and you get applause, and that's fantastic. Well, now you got to go execute it, because if you don't execute well, that's a real screw up, because everybody approved your idea and now you drop the ball. You need to go to the tactics. And the tactics are anything that can be bought, purchased, measured in time. What are the things you're going to use as a tactic? And then that moves into sort of things like cost and ROI, timing and next steps, and then finally, evaluate and refine. So it's really you put this whole thing together, and those 10 steps really guide you. And so the one thing we do, and I've always done, is try to get your best thinking. You may not have all the backup data in that one page, but if you can get it down to one page, the beauty of the 10-step process is I don't need to think about the 10-step process when I'm standing talking on my feet. It's been in my head for 45 years. So when I walk into an organization, and for 35 years on the client side, you walk into a corporation and you're asked to dealing with the CEO, the executive team, I don't need to have a list of questions because I've already got them in my head. Where are they? What are the things you're doing? So it's really a tremendous, it's an outline for a thinking process too.
And Jim, what I'm noticing in there, and tell me if I forgot this right, that process is simply answering a series of questions. It's
a structured format. That is correct. And that's what I think people don't recognize. And they, some will say, well, that's, I've had a few people say, well, it's pretty simple, isn't it? You have a whole book about it. I could have made this a tweet, right? I could have made it a tweet. But it's too important, So when they say to me, it's kind of simplistic, my response is, that's the point. That's the point. Get it down so that if the real shame of it is, I started, as I mentioned earlier, I was studying the education market, and teachers are fantastic people. They give their lives to trying to teach people and move forward. And I started looking at, well, what do they teach? First of all, teaching writing is hard. And a lot of teachers have not had training, and a lot of teachers were not taught to teach writing. And if they were, less than a half of them had a course that had a significant time taught writing, and less than a third had a full course on teaching writing. These are teachers, right? So that's why the National Writing Project exists, because they've realized how important it is. And that's when I realized there's a problem. Then I started reading into, well, what are the major writing styles that are taught? Narrative, expository, all these different things, but there's nothing that talks critical thinking and writing and putting those two together. And to me, I think we're missing, crazily enough, and I don't mean to sound like I'm critical of anybody, but if we taught, and I don't know what you'd call it, do you call it executive writing or strategic writing? But if you could teach people, and it doesn't require a whole semester of a course, but even a project to, start college or start high school, it could be done in high school. Here's 10 steps, now think through this problem. And have everybody get out of school, because what happens is they're getting into the workforce, and the whole big skills gap where I think it's 50 to 75% of managers over 3 major studies. Pay Scale had 60,000 managers in it. Inside Higher Ed and the American Association of Colleges and Universities, 45 to 75% of managers say recent grads can't do the 2 most important things they want, is problem solving and communication, particularly writing. And when they asked these grads in 2 of those 3 studies, rate your own proficiency. 2/3 to 80% of the recent grads said they are perfectly proficient. And that's called the skills gap. They don't even know they're not good at it. So if they could give, this 10 step, it doesn't have to just be for business. Any field you're in, this 10 steps helps you think.
Years ago, in the early 2000s, when blogs first started becoming popular, I started writing a blog post once a week, which forced me to write every week. And what I found was I had to think.
Yeah.
And what that did is I wrote about topics I knew, but I had to think and I went deeper. So the next time I was talking to someone, I could pull from what I had written last month.
Absolutely. That is the beauty of it, really. And hence I'll go back to my phrase, to write is to think. And I don't think enough people do it. And I think that we go back to the very beginning of this podcast, the biggest issue senior executives, their most precious personal resource is time. And if they're dealing with having to understand what is being written when it's sent to them, or if they have teams that they're having to rewrite their things and work with them, that's a big loss of time. And hence, corporations are now spending $37 billion a year, according to Inc. magazine, on remedial training, on writing. Even there's an article from MSNBC, an actual TV, where a woman was talking to somebody from one of the big financial firms who indicated we're even having to try and retrain and train writing to Ivy League grads. Now, that blows your mind. She even says they've accomplished so much. They're so smart, but they get out of college and they're not great at writing.
And Jim, I imagine that we're talking about, this isn't just misspelling or misplaced commas. What typically are the mistakes that these graduates are making in their writing? What are they seeing?
Well, you're right. It's my focus is I'm hardly a grammarian. The beauty of Word is it points out a lot of mistakes I make, but at least I pay attention to them. This book does not focus on grammar and syntax and all that kind of stuff and adverbs, and I don't do that. What I think the problem is, they're not thinking clearly. I think the structure is lost. So they don't know how to get from point A to point B. And I've read articles on why, and there's a lot of articles out there on why don't we teach critical thinking? And the beauty of this process is it kind of combines both. And in fact, my second book, they're both called Get Your Ducks in a Row with, by the way, the last name, just so nobody forgets, is ROWE, which is my last name. The second book, I realized there were so many things after the 10-step process of getting it down to one page I wanted to communicate, was I started realizing all these tips and tools I've learned in 45 years, and it almost became, the exercise in critical thinking to get to the point of communicating. So I created, and I had all these disparate thoughts, and I said, how do I pull this together? So I created an acronym, and I call it Learn the Adapter Method. And the adapter stands for analyze, deduce, author, perform as opposed to present, because it is a performance, tackle, which is the executional stage, and then evaluate and refine. And the one thing about being on a couple of things, one being on the client side, but then being on the agency side, and we were a smaller agency. When I left, we had like 36 people, and then we dealt a lot of times with smaller companies. We had to execute everything. So the beauty of my experience is, I worked on one of the biggest brands in the world at that time, Coca-Cola, but there was a building that helped on the tactics on that. When we worked, we had to get all that stuff done ourselves. So the beauty of what my experience provides is the adapter method. It's really the cycle of business. And the foundation is to write is to think. Adapter.
And we'll put that, description in. We'll put that in the description of this podcast. You'll find it down below. Adapter. Jim, communication and critical thinking. I'm hearing that the two, you can't separate them.
Thank you for saying that. They're inextricably linked. They depend upon each other. You can't communicate if you can't think, and you can't communicate properly, in my mind. And I think that's another thing. I think people kind of think of communication as, well, it's funny. I'd say it's a soft skill. They kind of view it as a soft skill. And for many years, the last decade, let's say, education, and why has this been happening? Well, the focus, and this isn't the educator's fault, because the colleges are asking the corporations, what do you need? And so I need science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM courses. So the focus has been, we're falling behind as a country, go after the STEM courses. Well, there's a new book out about a year ago, I guess, called The Great Skills Gap. And one of the first chapters is, I can't remember who it was written by, but it's actually a lot of different people wrote it. Folks at a couple of professors at Berkeley kind of pulled it all together. But Berkeley or Stanford, sorry. But the focus of this is that they have realized they dropped, there's only a certain amount of courses you could take. So they dropped arts, the liberal arts courses. Now they're talking about, instead of the STEM courses, they are thinking they should call them the STEAM courses. STA, and the A stands for arts. So let's not forget the arts. And it's not just creative, it's the ability to communicate. I think we underestimate the importance of communication. And I think that thinking communication part is probably the primary. You ask a senior manager, what do I want? What are the top 2 skills they want? They want the soft skills. They want them to be able to think, and they want them to be able to communicate. Because that's the foundation for everything we do. At whatever field, whether you're a doctor or, a school educator. I mean, it's, and of course in business.
And I'm thinking, when you mentioned the importance of the arts, I'm thinking of Steve Jobs. We wouldn't have Apple without Steve Jobs taking arts.
Yes, and that's right. He traveled around the world. He learned all sorts of things about design. And they had something recently I read this weekend about Steve Jobs and how he's impacted the world, and how much he's really contributed. Think about what we're holding in our hands every day. And it wasn't just one product. He just kept doing it. I actually mentioned him. My books, are, as we talked about, are a fable. So it's a fable about ducks in business. So in business, his name is Duck Jobs. In my books, he's Duck Jobs. He's not Steve Jobs. He's Duck Jobs. And I do say that there's, he's probably been one of the most greatest impacts on the world, although Elon Duck is having a big impact these days as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jim, in preparing to wrap up, if you could sit down with a corporate leader who is frustrated with the level, the communication skills, the critical thinking skills of their staff, if you could sit down with them, this corporate leader, if you could give them 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice of what they could implement in how they manage these people to get them better, what might that be?
Well, I hate to sound redundant, but I would say to them, I do believe that, get the book yourself and read it first. And then you can go onto my site and build them, buy them in bulk quantities. But if they learn the 10 steps, and a lot of them are spending tens of thousands of dollars on all this corporate training. If they could get down and read the book, get everybody to a book and have them read it, and then hand out the 1-page, 10 steps, and say to everybody, let's operate the organization this way. Let's use that, because whenever I had a meeting with my staff, or when I go into a client, every meeting I have, I'm using that as the foundation of communication. And if we all got on the same page, if they just saved 2 hours a week for every employee, that's a 5% increase in productivity. And so that would be my first step. And then, if for the senior people, maybe you get them the second book and have them understand the critical thinking process. But boy, I tell you, that 1 page is, it's so simple, but it's so effective.
And Jim, I think I heard a message in there is that investing in improving the communication skills saves money.
Well, yeah, it saves money. And because what is the big phrase that we've heard all of our lives? Time is money. And think about I'm going to go back to kind of where I started in terms of the senior executive, his most precious personal resource is time. And wouldn't it, when I walk into a meeting and everybody's not sure, nobody had an agenda. I have a very good friend who was just hired away from a big company to go be the account person at another huge company. We know all the names. And in the interview, because he read the book and he loved it, and he said to me, you know what? One of the questions they said, and the point they made, it would be great if you could just get here and get everybody to have an agenda for the meeting. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible that an enormous organization is concerned that nobody is pulling the team together? I have another friend who's at a small company, read the book, loved it. He said, I'm thinking of using this for everybody because our Zoom meetings, because they're all over the country, they're chaotic and people are talking. Like, just go through the simple 10-step process. You know, when you're setting up for a golf swing, there's about 6 steps you got to do, and trying to keep them all in your mind is one thing. The same goes true for communication and thinking. Follow the format and everything is going to be a little bit easier for you.
Powerful advice. My guest today is Jim Rowe, reminding you that to write is to think.
If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.